We are very fortunate today to have not only a speaker from the Senate, but also a member of the leadership of the House to bring us up to date on just where we stand in the budget process in the House. Bryan Cutler is a legislator from the 100th District. That's in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He was first elected in 2006. He was elected majority whip in 2015. So in a very short period of time, he's moved from just a freshman member of the House to a major leadership position. He's a lawyer. He worked before he became a lawyer in the hospital industry and has had a number of experiences which give him some expertise in the healthcare field. It's a great pleasure to have Bryan Cutler with us. Thank you.
Good morning. All right, good. Glad to see you guys are all attentive here this morning and with such a great response. I think Leader Corman did a great job kind of highlighting where we're at. I'll just kind of backfill a couple of the other issues that weren't covered in the Q&A, and then I'll leave some time for questions as well, Mr. Anton, if that's okay. Personally, I'm very excited being a new member of leadership. I really don't have a perspective in terms of how things always go in terms of budget negotiations this time of the year because I don't have a comparison point. However, I am very excited about the fact that I think the House and the Senate are working very well together. When you look at the issues that Leader Corman just covered in terms of liquor privatization and pension reform and a budget agreement, I think we've made great progress. To his point, all of those bills will be on the governor's desk in time for him to make the decision. For him to make the decision if he's going to be the one individual who stands in the way of progress, as well as making the decision about whether or not government should be funded and continue to operate. And I think that's important because all too often there's this misperception that here in Harrisburg we're somehow like Washington, D.C. And we're not. When you look at the things that we have done, and I'll use last session as an example. 680 bills were signed into law. 610 of them had some kind of bipartisan support last session, the vast majority of which passed unanimously. You fast forward to this year, even with divided government, the governor's already signing bills. We're moving bills between chambers. We're making progress. And we're making progress on issues that you may not have paid attention to or necessarily noticed before. Just last week, we passed an education reform bill that would reform teacher tenure in the House, and to get the amendment in, we had Democratic support. You look, yeah, that is worth clapping. That was, being the guy who was counting those votes, I definitely was working, and thankfully we were accurate. But you look at that, and there are some issues that traditionally have been very divisive. And yet we're finding agreement in a bipartisan way on many of these issues. In terms of the budget, obviously, we did lift that ourselves out of the House. 112 Republican votes currently in the Senate, progressing over there as well. Liquor privatization, we did lift ourselves, but we have had discussions, and it is my understanding that negotiations, as Jake said, are ongoing with the governor, but absent that, we want to prove we have solutions and we have ideas, and more importantly, we have ideas that have a majority of not just our votes, but the majority of, overwhelming majority of public support. When you look at these issues, and I want to be very clear, we're not daisy chaining them together in terms of, we have to have liquor to have a budget. But I will say this, we have to have liquor if you want to take advantage of the revenue that's there. And it's up to the governor if he wants to move that $220 million of revenue that is booked in the budget off the table. I believe that the message was very clear. His tax plan, which we heard again and again and again, all through budget hearings, had to be considered holistically. The exact words by many of the folks in the administration were, you can't pick and choose what you want. You have to look at it in its entirety. We did that in the House. It was rejected in its entirety, 193-0. And while some of the critics might say that it was shenanigans or some kind of not real vote, I take that job very seriously. And that vote was every bit as real as every other vote that we've taken. And when you look at that vote, it was very clear that there was no support for that plan. And my colleague from Montgomery County, Representative Kate Harper, did a great job explaining the budget earlier this week, or actually over the weekend. But she said you can't spend what you don't have. So when you look at that, we have to craft a budget that lives within our means with the revenues we currently have on the table. This budget does it. It invests significantly in education. It addresses the core functions of government, allows them to continue operating. Last night in the House, for anybody who was watching, Pitt, Penn State, Temple, Lincoln, and Penn all have non-preferreds that come through the system. They require a 2/3 vote, which means we need bipartisan support for that. The House proposals were a 3% increase, and they did not garner a single Democratic vote as we moved them through the process. Now, Leader Reed and I put a motion in to reconsider because we believe that that is an integral part of the funding. But the fact remains, we're going to have bipartisan agreement on that. And I don't believe that you can stand and say, we need more than 3% when you voted down the very plan that would have funded it. So again, you have to live within our means. I think we're doing an excellent job in doing that. And I look forward to moving the budget through. In terms of pensions, I kind of got pulled the short straw. I'm doing all the law reviews and the legal case review on that. I believe we're on very solid ground. We can make changes to the gentleman's question about current employees. I do believe, particularly from an actuarial standpoint, the anti-spiking provisions that would smooth out the average salary, I think that we can make changes that are actuarially required. And it's interesting, as you read those cases, while they use the language contract right, they actually tend to treat it more like a property right, which would make more sense. And there's an equal number of cases that actually get into the idea that for actuarial reasons, that you can in fact make changes going forward. And that is for the solvency of the fund. At 60% funded, and as the leader pointed out, we are one market correction away from a disaster. And some would argue that we're already there. And when you look at that, I believe we need to take decisive action to shore up that system right now. And I think that Senate Bill 1 is a great start to do just that. And when you look at it, I have argued, I've been to, I see my former colleague here, Representative Denlinger, we were at the same dinner that I'm going to reference when we went to the PSEA regional PACE dinner, which is their political action committee. And we were there, and we spoke about a whole bunch of issues, talked about paycheck protection, which was one of my bills. They asked questions, and I was happy to provide answers. But we also talked about pensions. And I said, here's my perspective as a young person. I do not believe Social Security is going to be there for me. And in terms of the pension, I don't believe that it's going to be there to the degree that it's been promised as a young person. So I think it's only fair to be honest with both the taxpayers and those counting on the pensions and say, let's take a good hard look at this and make the changes we need to make. Now, my opinion, anybody who's nearing retirement should be the most aggressively supportive person for pension reform because they're much nearer to retirement than me. And what we don't want to see happen is a Detroit case, or a Grand Falls, Rhode Island case where you had the police and fire unions negotiating away existing benefits. There's a whole host of policy as well as constitutional issues there. But I don't want anybody to ever get a letter that says, I'm sorry, you get 41 cents on the dollar. And I want to be very clear on something. This is not the employee's fault. To their credit, they have year after year after year put in every dime that we've asked them. And that's something that's sometimes lost in the debate. And we've accrued a very, very large bill, in excess of $50 billion. And when you look at that, it needs to be addressed because there's really two parts to the pension problem. The first is we have to stop digging. Senate Bill 1 gets us there as well as has savings in order to start funding the system better. And then we have to figure out a way to pay that bill. I think that Senate Bill 1's a wonderful start to that, and we can certainly have a lot of discussions about that going forward. But the reality is anybody who's in the system should be fighting the most for pension reform. And then we as taxpayers should also be fighting for pension reform because ultimately we're the ones that currently bear the risk, and the risk-sharing piece that is in the bill, I think, is excellent in terms of sharing not just future gains, but also future losses in terms of having that spread out in terms of risk. Liquor privatization, as the leader pointed out, it's not exactly what we voted for in the House, but I'll tell you what, it's still great progress. I was very excited when I saw the proposal. My understanding is it will be moving today. You're going to see a lot of back and forth as bills travel from chamber to chamber. It will be 2 very long days here as we head into the 30th, I'm sure. But again, I'll reiterate what I opened with, and that is all of these bills are destined to the governor. It will be up to him to choose what to do with them. I think, and I've heard overwhelmingly from my constituents, and it's not just those in the 100th district, pension reform, liquor privatization, and a balanced budget with no new taxes is also a mandate. Because as the leader pointed out, while the governor won, and he ran on education funding, which this budget has, and a severance tax, which we have, but we call it an impact fee. We also picked up a historic number of seats in both the House and the Senate in areas that are overwhelmingly conservative. And just as the governor won an election and needs to represent his constituencies, so do we. And I think that our proposals do an excellent job of that. Like I said, I've been very happy with how we're working with the Senate, the coordination in terms of and the discussions on the major policy issues. Look forward to that continuing, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Is it correct to say that all the details on both pensions and liquor privatization have not been ironed out, but you expect they will be before the deadline for passage?
Oh, absolutely. For whatever is not ironed out will be. In the House, our rules are a little different. We're waiting for the PERC note. My understanding is PERC is meeting today at 4:30, I believe, and then we will begin debate on the bill. So in that regard, the details have been worked out. We did, as the leader pointed out, remove the buy-up portion for current employees to maintain their current benefit, but we still did leave all the other pieces in place in terms of new employees.
And how about liquor?
Well, again, I'm not as...
Are there issues?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, my understanding is the Senate's moving it. I do know their rules are a little bit different in terms of when they can amend. So that probably is a better question for Mr. Corman. But my understanding is, and it's been sunshined already in the House, that we'll be voting it tomorrow.
Okay. How about your attitude or the attitude toward taxing Marcellus Shale?
Well, like I kind of probably oversimplified it, to be very honest. We do have a tax. We just call it a fee. You know, you look at what the IFO said, so I think it's like a 4.7% effective rate. The governor's asking for 5% with a price ceiling. You know, to borrow Leader Corman's line, what the governor is suffering from right now is a math problem in terms of what the money that 5% rate would raise. It's not going to raise $1 billion as was bantered about in the campaign, and there's a variety of reasons for that. You know, there's a lot of issues in regards to the way that is calculated. I don't believe, you know, you look at our current fee, it's several hundred million, which is excellent for local economies and local projects that are directly impacted by the drilling, which then frees up money for areas even in Lancaster County where we have farmland preservation, we have greenway preservation, parks, and water. You know, there's water projects, all kinds of things going on. But the reality is it's not $1 billion. And, you know, and in regards to the $1 billion fallacy that somehow education was cut by $1 billion 4 or 5 years ago. First of all, we've added money to education every year since then, and that money is being discounted and not being counted at all. Second of all, the piece that I believe a lot of folks are overlooking is the fact that pension payments is the worm in the apple that's eating it out from the inside. When you look at $100 million, the basic ed line, Our pension payment increased by $500 million this year. Government is the only business that can somehow claim that the costs of maintaining employee benefits aren't in their overhead. It's got to be considered. You have to account for that and make other changes accordingly. And we're scheduled to go up another $500 million next year, or more, depending on what happens over the next year. And when you look at that, it has to be dealt with. I said it's a two-part problem. You got to stop digging, then pay the bill. And we have to stop the accrual of that liability.
There is a commission that is either just issued its report or is about to issue its report on general funding of education. Could you comment on that and when that might be taken up, or whether anything will happen there to change hold harmless and other things of that type?
Sure, and that's, in the interest of full disclosure, I come from a fast-growing rural area that is harmed by the current formula. So that may give me somewhat of a bias in terms of my perspective. But our property taxes, very simply, are going up at a much higher rate than everywhere else in the state. Because of hold harmless, you get a small increase, guaranteed increase every year. While other costs are going up more than the 1.82% that comes into the education funding formula every year, growing districts have to make that up with property taxes. We've seen it in Lancaster County, you see it in Berks. It's very regional. And when you pull the vote, that's the one vote that is overwhelmingly nonpartisan. That is the oddest board I've ever seen in terms of red and green on who supports it and who doesn't. But it's all geographical. It's Chester County, Lancaster, York, Berks, Adam, Northeast, Monroe, Pike. You look at those areas. It needs to be addressed. The BEF does not touch hold harmless right away. Our budget proposal does, in fact, allocate the extra $100 million according to that new formula, and that's currently in the Senate. It's a great start because it takes into account issues of poverty, issues of density or sparsity for rural districts such as the one that I'm from in Solanco. In terms of, it recognizes the transportation costs that are associated with a geographically wide district. I have friends who live in Lewistown. Their kids are on the bus for over an hour, one way. And it's just by virtue of the geography to get the critical mass of students at the school. And, so that is accounted for in the formula. PASBO, the School Boards Association, I know is very involved in that. So I know that that is a very diverse organization, just like many of the organizations you all are from. And it does take into account many of those items. There are some things I would love to see addressed. One is the preferential tax treatment of properties associated with clean and green. And I'll use a local example. Lancaster City loses 37% of their tax base to nonprofits in clean and green in the aggregate. Overwhelmingly nonprofits. They literally only have like 1 or 2 parcels of clean and green property. And yet they lose 37% of their tax base. In Solanco, because of preferential tax treatment related to clean and green, we lose 39% of our tax base. And the difference between us and the city is their tax base is a lot larger, and they can shift that to some degree within it. Solanco has no other economy other than farms. And the problem or the disparity comes from the difference in the use assessment that the tax uses versus the market assessment. And there's about 36 school districts in the Commonwealth, which were detailed in a report from, I believe it was 2007-8 session, Legislative Budget and Finance, that are disproportionately impacted by clean and green in terms of their overall tax base. And it's no surprise, it tends to be the rural central school districts that have that impact. And to be clear, fully supportive of Clean and Green. I think it's a great program. We need it for our Bay strategy in meeting a lot of the things in terms of land management. But I also think that we have to recognize the impacts that it has on tax policy and school funding at the state level.
Other questions? Any questions? Yes. Yes, sir. Yes. State your name and ask your question.
Todd Kiefer. I just want to know on the pension issue, if you think there would be any chance at all for the current employees who, some of them may understand the benefits of ownership and portability with defined contribution, to give the current employees the option to go into the new system, those who want to.
Yeah, personally, I mean, I'll speak personally. I would love that, although the bill does move us into the new system, because that was one of the things I asked for the last time we talked about pension reform. Again, as a younger person, I would much rather manage my own money, because to be honest, right now, you're guaranteed a 4% return on your money, and everybody saw what the stock market did last year. It was way in excess of 4%, and yet the state got to accrue that benefit. Now, to be fair, you are insured against a loss, so I understand why that it's only 4%. As a young person, I'd love that option, but the other mechanic that we have to work within is the idea of getting 102 votes and 26, and then hopefully one from the governor in terms of a signature.
Other questions? Yes, that lady there.
Hi, Michael, from Upper Northern. Paycheck protection, you mentioned, but what is the status on it?
Well, the status on that is the Senate did have a vote. It was a tie vote that was ultimately broke by the lieutenant governor to the negative. So that issue is still something I'm very interested in. For me, it's very simple. I don't believe that you should commingle political activity with government assets. And right now, we are, for those who may not be familiar with this, we are collecting political donations on behalf of certain groups, which happen to be the state unions, and we manage and distribute that money for them. We collect it from their employees, and then we send it to their organizations. To be clear, we did have one of our members ask if their employee could, in fact, make a donation to their campaign account, and whether or not our comptroller would withhold it. And they had a very nice letter that said, no, that would violate the law. And I believe that all state employees should be treated equally. And in this regard, in terms of political activity, we're free to send checks to whomever we want. I just believe that all state employees should have that same distinction. So at this point, I'm very excited about it, still working it. We're a lot further ahead than we were 4 years ago, but we're not quite there yet.
Any other broad-based questions? Yes, ma'am.
Not about the budget.
Go ahead.
Okay. Representative Cutler, is it 1336 is the merit-based selection of judges? Could you just speak to that?
Sure. Merit selection is something that I've advocated for several terms. And it's, I think if you look at both the current system that we have and the current election that's going on, I seriously question the way we pick our judges, because right now I think a lot of it comes from high name ID. You ran for another public office or something along those lines. You're able to raise a lot of money, typically from special interests, or you come from a geographical base that drives your voter turnout. And that, in my opinion, does not always pick the best individuals for judicial qualities. I think that many of the scandals that we have seen over the Supreme Court, whether it is using public resources to campaign again, which again, I referenced in paycheck protection, but we had a justice resign over that. We had a justice resign over an email scandal. And I think that is what happens sometimes when you commingle the possibility of having individuals have potential litigants coming before them. There was a case in West Virginia where a large operator of a coal mine